Hey everyone, this is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. I'll get started in a minute. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to give an explanation of where Congress is in this process of reauthorization and the bipartisan infrastructure deal. This is going to be a little bit more on the politics and what's happening, but I can also answer questions about sort of what is in the underlying bills, et cetera, as we get to the end. But please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, and I'll try to watch that as I'm going through the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, a second. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about three bills. So the transportation reauthorization, which is what we have been working on for a while, the bipartisan infrastructure framework, and then the reconciliation project, which will cover some of the other bills. So just to get through some of the terms, again, the transportation reauthorization, this is the regular order for Congress. It's the normal transportation bill. It covers 5 years of policy and of funding. And we've been working on the House Invest in America bill and then the Senate Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, or the STRA. And then the bipartisan infrastructure package, this is the result of Biden's American Jobs Plan, where he was looking to increase investment in infrastructure, but it's really, it's more like a stimulus. It's a one-time investment in physical infrastructure and doesn't come with policy. And right now, it's the deal that Biden made with the 22 senators on that. And then, oops, so this is coming in later. So and then when we talk about reconciliation, we're talking about a totally different bill, they're calling it human infrastructure. So it's childcare, it's free college, it's, you know, all of those other sort of human infrastructure things that have been coming up for years, but have been, Biden's been talking about it sort of what we've noticed through COVID. And so that comes from the Biden America's Family Plan. So the two we're most interested in at the League of American Bicyclists is the reauthorization and then the infrastructure package. And this is saying similar things. Again, the transportation reauthorization, that's what we work on now. That's what the FAST Act was, MAP 21. It's transportation only. So it's not even infrastructure. It's not even physical infrastructure. It's transportation. It's 5 years. It reauthorizes the gas tax. It includes all the policy. And it's something that Congress has been working on and writing legislative text for and debating for 3 years. And it's just come to fruition this year. So the bipartisan infrastructure package, again, it started with it's a response to the Biden's American Jobs Plan. It's a one-time infusion of cash, but it's larger than just transportation. It's water, it's broadband, it's the power grid, and it's very light on policy, because any policy in that, it's just temporary. It's just for that amount of money that's spent. And to give you a sense, the roads and highways section of the transportation reauthorization bill is $311 billion over 5 years. And the BIF is $109 billion over 5 years. So it's about, if the reauth is 5 years, the BIF is the equivalent of 2 years of funding, but spread out over 5 to 8 years. They say, you know, it's different things each time. And again, it's the agreement on so what we saw at the White House a few weeks ago was just the high level numbers, and the text is still being debated and written this week you know, they keep saying, well, they made an agreement a month ago. Why don't they have the language? Again, it took them 3 years to get the reauthorization through. So it's not actually that surprising that it would take them a month to get there. Let me see. So Biden's goal and Schumer's goal for the Senate is to combine the reauthorization, the Senate reauthorization, with the BIF and vote on them in the next couple of weeks. Because we know that Congress is supposed to go on recess for most of August. Schumer can keep them here, and he might keep them here for a weekend, but he doesn't want to be here through August. So, you know, we'll see what happens. We often, and Congress works best, like all of us do, when we're up against a deadline. And so this is always a big deadline for Congress. But they also, the president and Leader Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, they want to do this infrastructure piece with Reauth, but then they also want to do that budget resolution on the human infrastructure also in the next 3 weeks, which is a very, very tight timeline. The other reason I'm talking about reconciliation a little bit is because sort of there's this sense that if the BIF fails, you know, maybe you can put infrastructure in there, or maybe if we don't get what we want out of the BIF, we could put it in reconciliation. That is unlikely to happen because the president has said he wants no double dipping. So he doesn't want any physical infrastructure in the human infrastructure bill. And that is because he so wants this to be bipartisan. That's sort of something he can offer to the Republicans, that they're going to have some say over all of the physical infrastructure. The other thing is then you have the physical and the human infrastructure competing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure framework. This is the one where there was an agreement at the White House, a big deal a month ago. Here we can see some of the leaders of that. Here are the folks, again, these are the 22 senators that are writing the BIF. Okay, yeah, and I got a question about the slides. I'll send them out to the group and we'll figure out how to put them up on a blog. Okay, so that's the group of senators deciding it. This is, I just want to give you a little background of sort of where we came and where we are now. So under the American Jobs Plan, what Biden put out, these are the numbers that he put out in terms for for transportation infrastructure. So the safety is more, it's sort of pipelines, it's NHTSA funding, it's vehicle safety, it's things like that. Reconnecting communities is that equity is an equity program where they built a highway in between a community, this would help either remove that highway or maybe build over it or reconnect that community. There's also funding in there to help low income or underserved communities be able to get projects to the point where they're ready to be funded. So that's the thriving communities and the reconnecting communities piece. So what you can see from this is that where Biden started out with some pretty high numbers and where he ended up in the BIF is not quite those numbers, right? But if you look at the breakdown of those funds, so even though it's smaller than what he wanted, the BIF is a lot, at least when you look at the big picture of the types of funding, the bipartisan infrastructure framework or BIF, it looks a lot more like the Biden American Jobs Plan than what the Republicans proposed at the beginning. So he didn't get all the funding he wanted. He did at sort of this middle level get the breakdown he wanted. So what did they have to decide? Well, first they had to decide sort of those overall funding levels, which we just looked at, but also how are they defining new money? So, you know, I saw that 109, I thought, okay, they are starting fresh on 109 billion new money for roads and highways. The reality is that they looked at the Senate reauthorization bill, the STRA, and said, oh, well, there's already about 50 billion new there. So we're only going to talk about 60 billion. And so the package gets even smaller, or what this group of 22 is talking about gets smaller because they're taking the changes already made in the EPW bill for half of it. And then they had to figure out sort of how are we going to spend that money and how are we going to raise the money to spend it. And there's a lot of questions about, are they going to create a new program? Are they just going to beef up existing programs? And then where does the funding come from? If you've been watching the news, they were thinking of one of the pay-fors was to invest in the IRS to go after people who haven't paid their taxes. That has fallen off. That was something the Democrats wanted, the Republicans didn't. That's out. The Republicans want to use some of the COVID relief money that states have already gotten, and the Democrats have pushed back on that. But there's going to have to be some sort of compromise on how they're going to come up with this money. President Biden has said no new taxes for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. The Republicans are trying to break into that. So we'll see what happens. And then the third part is that they have to turn it into legislative language. But one of the things that's interesting about this bill is that the senators, those 22 senators who are deciding it, they're not necessarily, most of them are not members of the committees that generally write the bills. So there's a little bit of a disconnect from the people that always work on transportation funding to this group deciding where the money's going to go. And this is another way to look at those bipartisan groups based on who's on what committee. So about half the members are on at least one committee that works on reauthorization. But when you think of, okay, there's 60 billion in roads and highways, there's only 3 members that overlap with the 20-person committee that usually writes that. And both Senator Kelly and Graham are new to the committee. So it's a lot of people that usually don't do that. Roger Wicker from Mississippi, he is the ranking member on the Commerce Committee. So he actually has staff that writes transportation legislation, but he's the only one. And then the finance folks, they're really important for the pay-fors and stuff like that, but they're not usually the ones writing the policy for railroads or transit or biking and walking or roads. So it's an interesting group of folks who are in charge of this. And then just a little bit of the content, they are trying to take it from sort of what was in the American Jobs Plan. So the American Jobs Plan talked a lot about bridges. They were going to do 10,000 bridges, and they were going to do, I think, the 7 or 10 most important or busiest bridges that are, how do they say it? That are, I don't know if it's functionally deficient or something like that, need to be updated. So what I've heard in this, functionally obsolete, thank you, Christopher. So the top 10 bridges that are functionally obsolete were highlighted in the American Jobs Plan. What we're seeing in the bipartisan infrastructure framework is that they also want to highlight bridges. So that's something, this is where you've got agreement on, sort of the medium scale, but then the details will be important because the American Jobs Plan had this idea of fixing it right. So making sure our roads and bridges work for all users and was resilient. We don't know if we're going to see that language in the BIF. Also, when it comes to electrifying fleets, that was something that was really important in the Biden plan that, to my knowledge, is in the bipartisan infrastructure framework, or at least they've talked about it. And then the last thing they've talked about is just plussing up the programs that are already in the reauthorization bill. Honestly, the American Jobs Plan had a lot of great things in it for us, from the Fix It First to the Safe Streets for All, to new funding for transportation alternatives and block grants and congestion mitigation. We do well under all those things. We do pretty well under the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act has all of the changes we asked for in transportation alternatives, but it's not another $5 billion. So yeah, specifically what it means for bike ped. Again, the way that the Biden plan was written, there was 15 billion for biking and walking, 5 billion in transportation alternatives, and 10 billion in the safe streets for all. We are not like I said, we're not looking at quite that. We're not looking at that amount at all. What we're hearing from, or what I'm hearing about the bipartisan infrastructure framework negotiators, is that there's not quite the same support for biking and walking that we had in the Senate EPW committee or the House T&I bill. There's sort of a sense like you got so much in EPW, we don't need to do more for you. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to talk to offices about, that we're trying to push back, that, you know, we're part of the system, we need to get a fair share of that BIF. What I am hearing is that when you look at the funding that goes through the surface transportation reauthorization piece, because transportation alternatives is now a percentage, we'll get a chunk of that. And hopefully the funding that goes through HSIP, hopefully that will also fall into those new safety rules that we were successful in getting in the Senate reauthorization. So the big holdups right now, there's two to three big ones. On the policy side, transit is the biggest issue. Since the early 90s, there's been this debate that that transit should get 20% of the highway trust fund. So 80% roads, 20% transit. And that's what the Republicans want to break that. And so that is a huge issue for our allies who work on transit. And we know that it's easier for a community to be bicycle friendly if there's also a strong transit in the community. And this whole issue is really complicated because there's no, in the Senate reauthorization, they haven't written the transit title. So in this process of writing the BIF, they're also sort of writing the transit title. And that's confusing because the BIF agreement has 47 billion for transit. And if you compare that to the 109 for roads, then you've got more than 20%. Transit folks were happy with that. But now when you're talking the 311 that's in the roads section, plus an additional 60 on top of that, then that 47 doesn't quite look like enough. And that has been a major issue. Another issue is water infrastructure, because remember, this is a larger bill. It's all infrastructure, it's not transportation. And so that water infrastructure also goes through EPW. So it's creating some tension again between EPW and the BIF folks. And then of course, there's the big issue of how we're going to pay for it. And just with that, when I was talking about those 7 to 10 bridges that are considered functionally obsolete, Christopher Dowes from FHWA did want me to clarify that functionally obsolete does not mean unsafe. It just means it can't, it's not doing what it needs to do now. So bridges, it doesn't meet current standards. It doesn't meet current design standards. So just to clarify. So if you have been watching the news on this, there was a lot of news about how Majority Leader Schumer called for a vote on Wednesday to start the debate around this infrastructure package, and it failed. And the Republicans were saying, we can't vote for it because we don't know what's in the bill. That's true, and that's a fair argument. I will say the Senate has done this. They have voted to start debate before they had legislation before. It's not that different. It's just we're living in a time right now where there's just not a lot of trust between the two sides. And so they weren't able to do that. But if you think of Schumer's goal of sort of moving things along, he may have actually accomplished that. Because when that failed, a letter was sent from 11 Republicans to Schumer that said, if we have legislative language, if we're at least further along in the process next week, then we'll vote to start debate, even if every single thing isn't worked out. So he may have gotten what he wants overall, just a couple days late. And part of why they didn't want to vote on it now is that currently the bill and the way that they're hoping to pay for it, they've sent that over to the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office, their job is to look at those pay-fors and determine how much money that's going to bring in over the 5 or 8 years or whatever timeline they're looking at. And so once they know that estimate, then they go back and say, okay, is this going to make enough money for us to move forward on our plan, or are we going to cut back our plan, or are we going to come up with new pay-fors? But they're saying that they could have something, they say as soon as Monday, but Monday keeps sticking. So there's a possibility we'll see another vote soon. And remember, they're hoping to go out August 6th. So it's really like 2 weeks now that they'd have to do it. And just to let you know why that timing is such an issue, this is a really sort of high level view on Senate procedure where just showing why it takes so long, why they need at least a week to move a bill. And that's because based on their rules, if they don't have unanimous consent, Leader Schumer has to announce that he's going to have a vote 30 hours before that vote takes place. So that's why he announced on Friday or on Monday, the vote on Wednesday. And that vote is called a motion to proceed, which is, as I said, okay, we'll start talking about this bill. So you wait the 30 hours, you have the vote. If it passes, then senators can start filing amendments. And the Senate is different in the House in that the amendments don't have to be germane. So they can bring up anything. Rand Paul is, famous or infamous for this, for bringing up something completely unrelated. And this gives him an opportunity to talk about it on the floor. And so while that debate is happening, the amendments are filed. They're not in line to get voted on, but it gives the senators a chance to talk about what they want to talk about. And then they decide that they have to do a cloture vote. And so Schumer again has to announce, we're going to have a cloture vote. So we're going to vote to end debate. And then you actually have 30 hours till that vote. And then you have 30 hours to debate. And at that point, that's when they talk about, okay, these are the 6 amendments that we're going to allow. And that it's that cloture vote, which is where you get the filibuster, where you need the 60 votes to move on. And that's why, if they never vote to end debate, they can never have that final vote. And so this process takes a long time, even just to get to, okay, what are the amendments we're going to vote on? Okay, are we ready to vote? So that is sort of the process around the bipartisan infrastructure framework. When we talk about surface transportation, we know if you remember this part, there's 4 committees in the Senate that have to work on it. The Environment and Public Works does the highways and roads. They've done it. They've included our ask for transportation alternatives. They've included our ask for safety. There's a lot of good things in there on safety. They've changed a lot of the language. There's a requirement for FHWA to do a lot of safety research on how to both make biking and walking both safer and to encourage it. There's a step forward on an accessibility measure. There's some good things in that. The Commerce Committee took some first steps on vehicle safety and looking at the safety of people outside the vehicle. All that has happened. What hasn't happened again is banking. And again, this is really being held up. The Republican ranking member on banking is Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, who's just dug in his heels on, he doesn't want transit to get that 20%. He feels like Congress gave them too much in the COVID bills. And so it's been like, for a while, Democratic leaders were saying, we'll just add a Dem-only transit title to the bill, and hopefully the whole thing can still be bipartisan. But now that's becoming a bigger issue, especially now that it's being added to the BIF. Also the finance title, but it's really hard for the finance, the finance committee can't just pay for surface transportation reauthorization now. They have to pay for everything. And so that's why they haven't moved forward on the reauthorization title. But what that means for us specifically is that we were hoping that there could be a tax section in that finance title where we could get the bicycle commuter benefit back and that e-bike tax rebate. Right now, it's looking like that is not going to happen in the BIF. And so that is something that we're hoping we can get in reconciliation, and that it won't be seen as double dipping because it's not actually infrastructure. So that has been complicated by this whole process. So how is the BIF affecting Reauth? Well, first of all, that whole bipartisan thing, they're really struggling. The Republicans, they're arguing over the pay for us. The Democrats, particularly those outside of the 22 that are negotiating, are really concerned with backsliding. They're really, there's been a little bit of a tussle on whether or not these 22 can break into what's in STRA, what's in the reauthorization. So far they haven't, and the EPW Democrats are saying, no, that's our limit. If you break into our bills, we're not voting for this. And so that struggle is happening. And it's so tight that one of the things that's being discussed, because you've got those 22 senators, they're talking to their leadership in the White House, but nobody's talking to the House. And the thinking behind that is if we can get a bipartisan bill in the Senate, that President Biden can just push it through the House and just tell the House, you need to take what the Senate did because it's the only thing we can do, and just pass the Senate bill. And that has caused a huge issue for the Senate, for the House, because the House wrote that whole Invest in America Act. And so one of the things, when I do let me see this chart all the time about the House writes a bill and the Senate writes a bill, and they go into a conference committee, and you've got Democrats and Republicans from both the House and the Senate, and they work out that compromise bill in the conference committee. That is what always has happened on transportation legislation. I mean, the House bill is 800 pages, the Senate bill is going to be that long. They really try to come up with one bill. And if you look at the bills that they have written so far, it's pretty easy to tell that the staff had already been talking to each other. They used a lot of the same framing in it. And the plan was that in August, staff would sort of work through the two bills. They'd get as far as they could on a conference, and then in September, they would bring the members back in and they would agree to those things. But if we're getting to a point now, now that is all called in question. And so the other way that a bill can get passed, if it's not conferenced, is they do what they call the ping pong. So the Senate writes a bill, they pass it to the House maybe makes some tweaks, passes it back to the Senate, and then maybe the Senate passes it. Because in order for a bill to become a law, the House and the Senate have to pass the exact same language. And what the underlying threat, maybe threat's too strong a word, but the underlying message that's out there is that whatever the Senate passes is the only thing that's going to happen, and the House just has to pass it. And yes, there's a possibility that some Democrats in the House could say this isn't progressive enough, we don't want to do this. But if they do that, they might not get the reconciliation package. And so that's one piece. The other thing is, in order for Democrats to succeed in the 2022 elections, they need Biden to succeed. And this is his signature ask. So there's a lot of politics on that. And just to talk a little bit more about that, there's sort of two folks who are really leading on a House response to this. The first is Chairman DeFazio, who's chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, who wrote the Invest in America Act, and then of course, Speaker Pelosi. And so Chairman DeFazio is not going down without a fight. He is committed to getting his bill. Remember, he's been working on this. He entered Congress in 1987. He's been on the Transportation Committee all of those years. He's finally chairman. He wrote the bill of his career. And now the idea that it's not even going to be considered as they write the next 5-year bill, it's just, you can imagine it's not acceptable to him. So he is really pushing for conferencing. He's saying he won't vote for the Senate bill. He's attacking more the BIF than the EPW bill, but he's out there. He's written a dear colleague to the other members of the House saying, look, our bill is so much better. We have member designated earmarks. Those are or member designated projects. Those are the earmarks. So he's basically saying, if the House bill is in conference, none of you will get these projects. And that's 5.6 billion of projects. He's saying my bill is better on climate, it's better on EV. He says it's better on active transportation, all of these things. And he's getting support from committee members. He's even gotten Majority Leader Hoyer, who is second in command under Pelosi. He's gotten Leader Hoyer to say, we really want the Invest Act to be considered. We just did an action alert this past week saying, please ensure a process that takes the best ideas from both the House and the Senate, because there are a lot of things in the House bill that are stronger than the Senate bill. And, part of what we're seeing with this and part of DeFazio's struggle right now is that because his bill was not bipartisan, it's just his folks. Where had it been bipartisan, we would have seen some of the Republicans in the House possibly also joining him in saying, we need the House bill. And so it could have affected the Senate more. So that's sort of where he is. When we talk to when you get to Speaker Pelosi and where she is, she also obviously doesn't want the House cut out of anything, but she also wants an infrastructure bill, and she wants the human infrastructure bill, which is, when you think about Democratic priorities and what the party is known for, it's more some of that human infrastructure pieces than infrastructure. So what she has said is, yes, the Senate is working on those things. That's great. We want an infrastructure bill. We want a reauthorization bill, but we also want the human infrastructure. And she's not going to have the House vote on any infrastructure bill, any reauthorization bill, until she gets both the infrastructure bill and the human infrastructure bill on her desk. So if you remember when the agreement was announced, Biden first came out and said, oh, there's going to be this 2-track and I want both of them before I sign them. And then he had to walk that back because he's the one negotiating with the Republicans. But Speaker Pelosi has been saying that all along, and she has not backed off on that. And so that's just another piece of this puzzle. And to understand what she's asking for, when we talk about reconciliation, it's a 3-step process. First, you get that budget resolution, which is the high level, this is the total amount of money. And then it's sort of subject matter, this is how much gets spent on each subject matter, but they divide the subject matters based on the committees in their jurisdictions. So each committee would get a chunk of money. So EPW, the Environment and Public Works Committee, which writes, the roads and bridges, like they get a chunk, but they also do water infrastructure, or they do water issues and environmental issues. So they'll get a chunk. And then the Health and Human Services Committee, they'll get a chunk. And so everyone gets a chunk. And then that second step is then they get down to brass tacks. I get to spend X number of dollars, or we as a committee get to spend X number of dollars. How are we going to spend it? Where is it going to go? So again, the finance committee will get us a chunk of that money, and we are hoping they'll spend some of that on a bicycle commuter benefit and an e-bike rebate. And the best way for us to sell that in reconciliation is under climate, because they're really seeing this also as how to meet Biden's climate goals. And then once every committee has written its piece, they all get combined into a bill. I said budget resolution, that's the reconciliation bill at the end. So budget resolution first, committee work, reconciliation. And so, yeah. And so what Schumer is saying is that his goal for August 6th is not only the infrastructure piece, but also the budget resolution. But it doesn't mean that when they come back in September, Pelosi's going to be ready to vote on it, because she's saying you have to do all three of these steps and put those on my desk before I'm going to have a vote on either. So why is she doing that? One, because she really wants that human infrastructure piece to happen. She feels like the budget resolution, it isn't enough. That committee process can weigh things down. She needs to know that the Senate has the votes. Because again, this is because, and it's kind of funny because in the House, they only have a 3-vote majority. The Democrats only have a 3-vote majority, but because in the Senate, they need every single Democrat, then those Democrats right there, they have a little more power. We hear a lot about Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. She's like, I need to know that they're both on board and you're sending me something that deals with all these priorities before I'm giving you anything. And that is to force both President Biden and the Senate to get it done. Because honestly, if they just did the physical infrastructure piece, the transportation piece, I think Biden could call that a win and move on. And Pelosi's saying, nope, I need both pieces. But what that means for infrastructure is it gives DeFazio some more time to negotiate. If a bipartisan infrastructure framework passes, it also gives some time so that if the BIF doesn't pass, but the Senate is going to go forward with a reconciliation anyway, if they get Manchin and Sinema involved and all that, then they might try to put some of that physical infrastructure into the reconciliation. So it gives some time for that. So I have to say, it feels to me like both pieces are going to happen, and that this puzzle, they're going to get this puzzle done, and it'll be messy. It won't be exactly what anyone wants. It feels like that's going to happen, but it also feels like every piece needs to fall in the right order in order for that to happen. Oh, I didn't even write something there. And see, I was finishing this presentation just as I was getting on. So, but there is a question of what happens if the BIF fails. One question that's critical to me or to us is, can the reauthorization go forward even if the bipartisan infrastructure framework fails? It's possible because they kind of have to do it anyway. That transit piece would still have to get worked out. And it's difficult because then what are the pay-fors for the transportation reauthorization versus the larger bill? I'd like to think it could go forward. I also think it's really important to our interests that it goes forward, because I think if Congress were to change hands and we just get an extension till 2023, the Republicans in the transportation space are so angry in the House for being cut out. I think we'd see a very different bill. And even though biking and walking were not controversial this year, and there wasn't a partisan push, I think the the environmental conditions could make it such that the things we care about would be a lot less likely to be in that bill. The other thing is, okay, if BIF fails, can we put some of those infrastructure projects in the reconciliation? And the answer is yes, we can, but we can't put any of the policy in. So you might be able to put in more money into transportation alternatives, which we would love, but it would be hard to change the safety program to ensure states with high fatality rates are investing in bike ped safety. The other thing is that even though there's the infrastructure bill is 1.2 billion and then the reconciliation is 3.5, you think, well, okay, can we just add them together and have 4.7 and just add the infrastructure on top? From what I'm hearing, there's already a lot of moderate Democrats who are really uncomfortable with that $3.2 trillion, that even where they can get to a place where they could vote for one bill for 1.2 and one bill for 3.5, they can't get themselves to vote for one bill that's 4.7. And what that would mean is that they'd have to, if you put transportation and infrastructure within the reconciliation, now you're competing with all these other priorities, and there will be something, but it will likely be less. And so that's where we are. That's sort of where things are now. I think things that I'm watching is, what does the CBO come back on the infrastructure package on the BIF? And, can Schumer get that to the floor? And can he get through those, and then can he get through those votes? I think, when I think about the politics behind it, the Democrats really want to give Biden a win. And up until now, that when you look at the polling and how people are viewing the Biden administration, they see him as trying to be bipartisan. And so if it breaks down, the Republicans will likely get blamed. And so I think they're trying to figure out the politics around that. Everybody says they want infrastructure. Everybody wants to be able to go home and say, we put money to fix those potholes. We opened up that trail near your house. Like, I got that earmark to do that. And so they're like, it's tenuous, but I think they want to do something, and then we'll have to see. And I think if you're a Republican, you're weighing the fact that there may be transportation and infrastructure projects in the reconciliation, which I can't take credit for. So maybe it's good for me to help with this. And so that's sort of some of what's going on the Hill. It's, it's changing rapidly and it's really opaque. So it's hard to figure that out, but that's where we are. I'm going to stop now and see if there's questions. And I'll also say, I have slides on what's in both bills, so I can answer questions on that as well. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So please, if there's questions. Oops. All right, I'm not really seeing any. I don't know if that means that whole thing was too confusing. Okay, I did get a question. So the Connecting America's Active Transportation System. So it's in the House and it's funded out of the Highway Trust Fund in the House. In the Senate, we did that amendment, it got it authorized. So Congress is allowed to spend money on it, but it's not under the Highway Trust Fund. So money put into the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Program through the BIF would not necessarily go to that program. And that's another reason why we want the two conferenced, so that we can actually make that program happen. So yeah, so is there anything to specifically ask those 22 folks? We did an alert last week, and I think those are the general asks that we'd like to see the BIF include funding for active transportation, include upgrades to safety, and that third ask of go through a process so that the best ideas from both the House and the Senate are combined. And that final ask is really the most important one. Like, please ensure a process that the best ideas from both the House and the Senate are combined in a final transportation bill. Okay. And I do want to say, biking and walking is in a better position now than a lot of our friends over in the transit area, et cetera, because we did get our ass in both bills. Our ass were very bipartisan this year. So even if it is just the Senate bill, we will get transportation alternatives, we will get safety. Obviously, we'll still have to fight for that connecting active transportation, but the fact that the committee voted that the program should be allowed, it's a step forward. There's real improvements, in safety, but overall, the things in the House bill that we would lose are those larger policies like the fix it first, and strengthening performance measures, things like that. All right. So last call for questions. Otherwise, I'd say thanks, especially if you have one of those 22 in your state, consider looking at that action alert and pushing that out. It's also on our blog. I got a question about how linked are the bicycle and transit lobbies moved together, or will we have to go our own way at the end? I think right now we are supporting the transit piece. So again, that ask of include the best things from the House and the Senate gets to that transit piece. We do want a strong transit. In the end, what you might see, I think for us, a bill is imperative this Congress. Otherwise, we stay at our 850 and the rest of the programs keep growing bigger and bigger. So I think if a bill passes with the underlying surface transportation reauthorization bill in it, and the added BIF doesn't do anything egregious, I think I'm tempted to be supportive. I have to see the language. I think someone like T4 may come out against it because their biggest asks were the fix it first on the highway funding and on a particular highway program, and then they want to make transit and roads equal. So where we supported the surface transportation reauthorization bill, they did not. So I think you will see a little bit of that at the end. Another thing, we've been working a lot with the vehicle safety folks. The House bill, again, was not bipartisan. It's extremely strong on those things. We're definitely supportive of the House provisions there, but they didn't even go through a committee process. In the Senate, you have a bipartisan bill that went through the committee process that takes a first step on a lot of those safety measures. It's the first time we've seen anything on like the new car assessment look at people outside of cars. It's the first time they've talked about, oh, we need to set standards for crash avoidance technology, or for vulnerable road users, like do tests on how well these things work with vulnerable road users. So again, those folks may say we don't like the bill at all. Given the changes in the on safety and transportation alternatives, plus that first step on vehicle safety, I would rather take that than the current, more years in the current system where it doesn't even consider people outside of cars. So that's the debate. We are working with them on these asks. That I will say the climate lobby is in the same sort of place with us, where they want a much stronger bill like the House bill, but they really want that reconciliation bill. Because that's where the majority of their asks, that's where they really feel like we can make a difference for climate. But you can't, it's not clear that we can get a reconciliation bill until we get the infrastructure bill. And so we are unlikely to see any of the climate groups come out against a transportation bill. So yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces and it's very complicated. I think it's frustrating for people who are super progressive, because you see the Democrats controlling the House, controlling the Senate, controlling the White House, knowing it's unlikely to happen that way again for a decade. Is this, they really see this as a chance. And I think that's what that reconciliation offers, because that will be Democrats only. And so everyone's sort of doing that dance, and it's really complicated because you've got those 22 senators who don't always do transportation and aren't really talking. We're also just waiting to see what happens. All right. You can always email me if you have other questions, and I'm going to sign off, but thanks for joining. I will put the slides up. At least I'll send them by email, but we'll get them out in a blog pretty soon, and have a great weekend.